Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
Hey, David French, welcome back.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
I hope you're enjoying your summer. It has been brutally hot here in Chicago, which is not great.
Oh, it's ludicrous in Tennessee. Like, it's supposed to be 100 tomorrow, and it's only June. I was down in Douglasville, Georgia, and it felt like mid-August and mid-June, and that's just unacceptable.
Well, it's about to get a lot hotter because we are in Supreme Court decision season with all kinds of big cases on the docket that are set to be released in the next week or two. We are recording this on the morning of Wednesday, June 22nd. So we have yet to get the really big cases. But there's one I want to talk about, which dropped, was it just yesterday?
Yes.
Carson
yesterday.
v. Makin.
Yeah.
This has to do with religious liberty and public education and the state of Maine. Without getting into the deep weeds of this case, can you just briefly summarize the decision?
Yeah, it's real simple, actually. So Maine is the most rural state in the nation, Skye. I didn't know that. Now, that's not measuring by population density. Obviously, Alaska has a lower population density than Maine. But as far as the percentage of people living in a rural area, Maine's the most rural state in the nation, according to the Supreme Court. And so it has a lot of school districts with no high school. There's just not enough students. So what Maine has done is it gives families money to pay tuition at private schools, but it had put a condition on the money. One was accreditation. It can only go to a school that's accredited with the state or the New England Association. But the other one is it had to be non-sectarian.
So this is essentially a voucher program.
Basically,
okay,
right.
But you can't use the voucher for a religious school.
Right, exactly. Now, that by itself should have been struck down under existing precedent by the First Circuit post haste. Like, under the last 20 years of Supreme Court precedent, this sort of idea that says we're going to make a generally applicable federal benefit or state benefit, but we're going to withhold it from religious institutions, that's been identified as religious discrimination for a while now. So
if I understand this correctly, it would be unconstitutional for a government, a state government, whatever, to directly fund a religious institution.
No, that's not exactly right.
Okay,
that's not
so
exactly right.
Help me understand why the First Circuit or even some of the dissenting justices didn't think this was appropriate.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting question because what the First Circuit did is it said essentially there's a difference between status and use. So the previous Supreme Court cases had said that you can't withhold a government benefit merely on the basis that the status of the institution is religious. So one of the cases was a case called Trinity Lutheran, where a church was trying to take advantage of a Missouri program that allowed repaving of playgrounds with rubberized material so that kids would bounce when they fall. And the Supreme Court said, wait a minute. I mean, this is a secular program. You can't discriminate against Trinity Lutheran just because of its religious status, right?
Okay.
So
is that sorry to interrupt. Is that similar to the recent case in Boston with the flagpole where religious groups were being barred from raising a flag that any other group could put up in the public space? And they're saying, hey, if you're making this publicly available to any group, you can't say no to a group simply because it's religious.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the basic thrust of the precedent for a long time has been you got to treat religious groups the same way you treat everybody else. You can't treat them differently and worse because they're religious.
Okay.
And so way the First Circuit distinguished all those cases was saying those were status-based, but this money actually goes to religious use. In other words, like religious education itself.
Okay, so paving a playground is not religious. Hoisting a flag is not religious.
Right.
But instruction in a religion is religious.
Right, exactly. And they had some thread to hang on to. And this is a case that goes back many years called Locke v. Davie, which was a case involving a scholarship program in the state of Washington. And the scholarship program said you can use it for a bunch of different things. You can't use it to train a minister, in other words. So our state scholarship can't be used to train a pastor. And the Supreme Court upheld that restriction. This is a couple of decades ago or so.
Okay.
And so the First Circuit sort of saying, wait a minute, if you're really actually pouring money into religious instruction, that's religious use, that's not religious status. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not how we think about this. You're wiping out religious schools entirely on the basis of their religion. Our precedents have been clear about that. In this Locke v. Davie case, yeah, we're not going to overrule it, but it just basically means that if you're in Washington and you don't have to fund pastors, it's what's called confined to its facts, or to use a term from our Advisory Opinions podcast, it's zombie precedent now. It's not exactly, it's not a living, breathing legal entity anymore. It's just sort of an undead, moaning across the land sort of precedent.
So if I understand this, I keep saying if I understand because there's a good chance I don't. If I understand this ruling, if I am, say, a Jewish family in Maine and I want to send my kids to a secondary school that is run by my local synagogue, where they're going to learn math and science and English and history and all that, but they're also going to be instructed in Judaism and reciting the Torah and all that, I can take the voucher that the state has given me to that school. I can kind of understand, though, why a critic would say, wait a minute, why should my tax dollars be used for what, at least in part, will be religious instruction? Shouldn't that, at least that portion of the education, be excluded from funding by the state?
Well, but the issue here is really, if you're talking about the interplay between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause here, at the very least, the free exercise clause should mean that religious expression is not treated worse than secular expression. In other words, so it would definitely be a violation of the establishment clause if you said, for example, here's your voucher. You can use it at a sectarian institution, but not a non-sectarian institution.
Right, because that's favoring religion.
That's favoring religion. But if you say, here's your voucher, you can use it at a non-sectarian institution, but definitely not a sectarian institution, then what you're doing is you're disfavoring. And what the Supreme Court has said is, look, equal playing field here between religious and non-religious institutions when the purpose of the program is a secular purpose. In other words, that there's nobody who's come forward to say the purpose of this underlying program was to advantage religions. The purpose of the program was to get people to high school because many of these districts had no high school. And this principle of legal equality has been one that's been applied not just to these voucher programs, but to access to facilities, to access to all kinds of government benefits that were created for secular purposes so that religious institutions and religious individuals don't approach the government with a sort of a second-class citizen status.
Yeah, so there's been some hyperbolic response from the left on this ruling. It's yet another win in a mark in the win category for religious liberty, which has been going on for years now. But like the Vox headline, I thought this was interesting. The Vox headline was, the Supreme Court tears a new hole in the wall separating church and state.
No.
Which sounds like a horrific turn of events, as if this was an unprecedented and dramatic change of direction. Why is Vox wrong?
Well, let me put it this way. The case was so obvious that it was going to come out like this, that it would have been an earthquake had it come out differently, because it would have marked a massive change and shift in Supreme Court jurisprudence had it come out differently. And one of the things about a lot of the commentary, the Snap Twitter commentary that you saw, was this sort of line of cases. And now in this case, it was 6-3. In other words, all three Democratic nominees voted against. But it's the progeny of a line of cases stretching back 20 years or so, where time and time and time again, you see super majorities of the Supreme Court advancing this idea. of legal equality. So Trinity Lutheran was 7-2. And this was funding directly provided to a church by the state. And Breyer and Kagan joined the then 5 Republican nominees. There's multiple other cases I can point to that were 9-0 or 7-2, where if there's evidence that religious expression was singled out to be treated differently and worse, there would be a Kagan or a Breyer who would jump over and uphold religious liberty. Another very notable example of that is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which was 7-2 a few years ago. And so this sort of treating religious expression saying that religious expression has to be given essentially equal treatment is a long-standing, you don't want to use the phrase bipartisan because the Supreme Court isn't partisan, but it's a long-standing supermajority position of the Supreme Court. And anyone who doesn't really note that is not giving the full picture here.
Okay, so this case and the ruling yesterday resurrected a question for me that I've had for a long time. And I'm hoping there's a really simple answer to this, but I suspect there isn't. And that is, how does the law define what is actually a religion so that it qualifies under the First Amendment for free expression or, non-establishment by the state? And the reason I ask that is because part of what I read up on this Carson versus Makin ruling was that the original law in Maine, which prevented these vouchers from being used in certain schools, used the language of vouchers could pay for tuition at non-sectarian schools, but not schools that promoted, quote, faith or belief system, end quote.
Right.
So how do the courts come out on this? Like when someone is appealing for religious liberty or First Amendment freedom of expression of religion, like what are the boundaries on what the court understands religion to be? And this opens up a big can of worms, but is there a simple answer to that?
Yeah. So one of the ironies or interesting aspects of the free exercise clause and religious freedom jurisprudence is that it protects no faith at all as well as faith. So, a person who is an atheist can avail themselves of protections under, but they didn't generally do it under under the free speech clause of the First Amendment. But in essence, what you're talking about when you're talking about religion is it doesn't have to be theistic.
Right.
Religion is essentially, the court does not come in and sort of say, here's the list of recognized religions under which you can appeal to this free exercise clause. You can come in and you can be a religion of one.
What about the establishment clause, though? Because I think that's where it gets more contentious. What can the government not fund because it qualifies as religion? And the reason I bring this up is I think that this is what's behind a lot of the animating angst around many religious conservatives have around public schools. We saw this year in Florida around all the don't say gay bills and things like that. And the argument, which I'm sympathetic toward, is that I can't go into my kids' public schools. If I'm a teacher, I can't go into the public school and promote a definition of marriage as one man and one woman or genders a certain way because I would be accused of promoting a religiously based definition of sexuality and marriage. On the other hand, a public school can advocate for a secular progressive understanding of marriage as any two consenting adults, two men, two women, non-gender binary kind of stuff, because it's rooted in a secular or non-religious worldview, but it's still a belief system.
Yeah.
So the establishment clause would say taxpayer funding should not go to a school that's promoting a Christian sexual ethic, but it can go to a school that's promoting a secular sexual ethic. Why is one a religion and the other isn't?
So you just stated the argument for school choice.
Yes.
Pretty succinctly.
Yeah.
Which is if you are, for example, a small O Orthodox Bible-believing Christian who has a traditional Christian sexual ethic, a lot of what is taught in some public schools, not all, but some public schools, is going to be contrary to your worldview. It's going to be contrary to your theology. And so um, because you cannot vote out one school board, vote in another school board, and teach sort of the Baptist, to teach the Westminster Confession, so to speak, or teach Southern Baptist theology. You just can't do that. Well, then what's your option if you are worried about what your son or daughter is being taught? Your best option is a private school, and or homeschool, and that's the school choice argument. And this is something that's been going on for 30, 40 years, this argument. And in fact, there were cases filed decades ago arguing that secular humanism, do you remember that phrase from back in the day? There's been different phrases: secular humanism, political correctness, wokeness. There's all sort of different descriptions of left-leaning secular ideology, to say that secular humanism was a religion, and that schools that were teaching secular humanism were teaching a religion. And they all failed. Those cases all failed.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why many of these cases have failed is that, let's suppose a school has a Pride Month, right? Let's suppose a school celebrates a Pride Month. It's very difficult to say, well, this Pride Month, the celebration of Pride Month, discriminates against Christians from the perspective of the state, because there are other Christian denominations that go, nope, we've got the rainbow flag right outside of our church. So you can't say, well, this is anti-Christian. Now there are conservative Christians who would say, whoa, hold on, that's the mainline denominations have departed from true and orthodox Christianity, and so that's not authentic Christianity. They're teaching against authentic Christianity. But the state, the courts are not going to decide what's authentic Christianity. So
Sure.
You'll find on a lot of these issues like CRT or LGBT issues, you'll find Muslims on opposite sides of it, Jewish citizens on opposite sides of it. You'll find Christians on opposite sides of it. And when they're plunging down into what the school is actually teaching, what they won't find is the school taking an explicitly anti or pro-religious position. They're just taking a position about the underlying issue. And so the courts will just kind of say, we're not getting into what's true and authentic Christianity here. We're not getting into what's true and authentic Judaism. And by the way, when we look into the curriculum, we don't see them saying anything about Christianity one way or the other, or about Judaism one way or the other.
But I get that argument, but do you have to talk explicitly about what history or tradition would recognize as a religion to qualify as a religion? In other words, back in my undergrad years, took a lot of philosophy classes, religion classes was my major. I mean, one of the ongoing arguments is, do you define religion by intent or do you define it by function? So the chair analogy always came up. Is a chair because someone designed it to be sat upon? Or is a chair because I sit upon it? So my desk chair right here obviously is a chair because someone intended it to be used that way. But if I go out into my backyard and find a big rock or a log and I sit on it, does it become a chair because it's functioning as a chair for me? So wokeism, secular humanism, environmentalism, pick your ism. Most of us would say it's not a religion because it wasn't intended to be a religion. But for certain people, it certainly functions as a religion. It gives them a sense of meaning, of mission, of community, of ultimate purpose and definition of the universe. Ezra Klein wrote these really interesting pieces recently about how he's asked more than anything else whether or not it's appropriate to have children because of the environmental crisis and global warming. And like those are very religious implications of environmental. So you could have a public school that is driving all kinds of ideas about sexuality, marriage, mission, the future, eschatology, all these things, and none of it happening under the umbrella of what we would traditionally call religion. And yet it's functioning as a religion. So
yeah.
It's appropriate for the government to be funding at that point.
Yeah. So the interesting question, I would say funding is a different question from controlling. So a government school, a public school is a government controlled school versus a government funded school. So a voucher program will fund a school that the government doesn't control. But so for Establishment Clause purposes, this religion is not a synonym for a point of view.
Right, but that's what was confusing about the Maine statute, because it denied these vouchers to schools that promote a faith or belief system. Mm-hmm. Those things sound like belief systems, even if you don't call it a faith.
Right, which is why the program may have been vulnerable even to a secular challenge by somebody who wanted to spend the money at a school that may, or, lawsuits arise out of real world situations. So I want to go to school X. So therefore I'm suing to get a voucher to go to school X. They don't arise out of sort of theory all that much, where you would say, I want to go to a school that advances a point of view, but that school doesn't exist. So they're grounded in these sort of real world disputes. But in theory, if you had, for example, the Portland School of Environmental Progress,
it probably exists.
Then in theory, there might, you might have a real First Amendment claim centered around that denial of of access to a point of view. A little bit more complicated case, just because because it's denying based on a sort of a belief system. I think you would have much more of a vagueness kind of argument, because wait a minute, isn't every act of education
exactly
an advancement of a belief system of some kind? Which is exactly why the Establishment Clause line of thinking, unless it gets explicit, just falls apart if you're talking about challenging public education. Because that's when I was saying a point of view is not the same thing as a religion. There's just no way to fashion a curriculum that has no point of view.
Agreed.
There's just no way, but there is a way to fashion a curriculum. So I've actually won an Establishment Clause case in higher education. Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech, put together training materials for students, and Georgia Tech is a public university, that specifically endorsed some religions and condemned others based on their view of LGBT sexuality. So it was very explicit under these exact training materials at Georgia Tech that they endorsed Buddhism and condemned being a Baptist. So when you're explicit like that, you've got an Establishment Clause victory. But if Georgia Tech simply said, hey, we welcome LGBT students, that's not going to run afoul of the Establishment Clause, because it is not explicitly elevating one religion and condemning another. In the Establishment Clause context, you got to be pretty explicit. It's not just a synonym for a point of view.
It does feel, and I don't tend to be accused of siding with, right-wing culture warriors very much, but it does feel like this is a pretty significant loophole that can be exploited by progressive secularists. Because they can argue that the belief system that they are advocating for can find receptivity and even funding in the public square, in public schools, in government institutions, because they're not explicitly associated with a religion. Whereas more conservative people who may be part of a traditional religion, Christian, Catholic, Judaism, whatever their religion might be, are excluded from those same things because they are rooted in a religion. And that's at the heart of a lot of our cultural battles right now. A lot of people feel like secularism, wokeism, whatever label you want to put on it, is a belief system. It is a worldview. It is a competing vision of the world that plays on the same field as religion, but doesn't have the restrictions that our Constitution puts on religion.
Right.
Is that fair?
You have completely articulated why I've been a school choice advocate for more than 2 decades. Because there isn't a great way to deal with this outside of the choice context. Okay. Because You cannot say, there's no real feasible way to walk in and say public education should have no point of view.
Right.
So there's just no real great way to do that. Public education is always going to have a point of view. And in theory, just as you could have a teacher who's saying, look, we should celebrate Pride Month and LGBT, and be very tolerant and even affirming of LGBT sexuality, you can have a school that chooses not to celebrate Pride Month. And that doesn't make it a religious school that it doesn't celebrate Pride Month. Or you could have a school where, you could have a public school curriculum where there's abstinence-based sexual education, so long as it's not rooted in because the Bible said so, but because, teen pregnancy is a problem, it's an economic problem, it's a cultural problem. So you can have all kinds of socially conservative points of view in public education, so long as you're not appealing to religious authority to do so. So in that sense, whether you're talking about a pro-LGBT position or sort of a pro-traditional marriage position, those are both up for grabs in public education. It's just that neither one of them can be rooted in a theology. So if you're going to make a case or you're going to have a curriculum focused on X or Y position on a social issue, you can't root them specifically in a religious theology. If you do that, you're going to run afoul of the Establishment Clause. And so there's a couple of ways, this is why a lot of these school board fights get so intense, because you're saying, what is the point of view that will rule? What is the point of view that will reign here? Whereas school choice is a way that sort of cuts through that to say, wait a minute, shouldn't we, rather than be having a system where sort of majoritarian point of view controls, which is great for the majority, not so great for everybody else, can't we have a system which grants greater authority and autonomy and ability of parents to shape the education of their children, even when they're in minorities in a community, and even when their point of view isn't going to control? And so that's, to me, always been the appeal of school choice, is it's a way through this toe-to-toe fight in school boards that you see for majoritarian control over the point of view of the school.
It seems like the system we currently have, though, isn't, strictly speaking, it's not majoritarian point of view, because you may live in a community where the majority is Southern Baptist. And if those people walk into the school board and say, we want our Southern Baptist point of view infiltrating the education, they would be denied because it's based on a religious foundation. They would still have to make a non-sectarian appeal, wouldn't they? In which case, what ends up happening in the public school may be the minority point of view because it's rooted in a secular philosophy rather than a theology.
Well, yes and no. So if I'm an Episcopalian, say, and I have a pretty wide view of sexual, I have a very different view of sexuality from the Southern Baptist Church that's rooted in my Episcopalian theology, I don't get to advocate for that wider view of sexual morality based on my Episcopalian theology.
Right, but you could appeal to non-theology, because there's lots of secular views that would have that wider view of sexuality, whereas the Baptists would have a more difficult time making a non-sectarian appeal to their views on sexuality, marriage, or do they not? I mean, I'm saying, is it fair to, can we still have public schools if everybody agrees that we are going to build a curriculum without appealing to sectarian theology? And so you may have a traditional view of marriage. It may be rooted in your own Christian values.
Yeah.
But when you go into the public square, you need to make that appeal not based on scripture. You need to make it based on non-sectarian thought.
Well, so this is all gets so complicated, Skye. I can run for school board based on scripture.
Okay.
And say, my position as a member of the school board is I'm going to bring my Baptist convictions to the school board. Okay. And then when I'm in the school board, I can say, we're not going to have Pride Month. Okay. And that's not going to be Establishment Clause violation. I can say, we're going to have abstinence-based sexual education because teen sexuality carries with it a host of cultural and sociological problems. And that's not going to violate the establishment
Right. You
clause.
just can't teach the Bible in that sexuality class as the basis for the curriculum.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's a lot of room for socially conservative points of view when you're talking about public education. There's a lot of room. It's just, you can't say because and I'm reading this in the Baptist Faith and Message, or I'm reading this in Westminster, I'm reading this in the book of John.
So to wrap up this half of our conversation, if you're not a huge proponent of school vouchers and school choice, the other side would argue Christians or believers of whatever religious tradition just need to be more savvy at making their case for their point of view in a pluralistic public square, rather than trying to just appeal to their own sectarian beliefs and say they should be given preference. Is that an argument? I mean, part of what I see happening in some Christian communities and where these school board fights are happening is just Christians are making really lousy arguments that are not appealing to their non-Christian neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, that is very true. And because a lot of what happens is people are trapped in their own media bubbles and their own cocoons, and they've sort of lost the art of persuasion. They've lost the art of talking and meeting with somebody and meeting them where they are and having a conversation that's actually persuasive. And instead what they do is what they've captured is the art of mobilization. So there's different kinds of paradigms for political success. One is the persuasion paradigm, the other one's the mobilization paradigm. And they're often in utter tension with each other. And so if you think you've got a majority in a community, you might go for the mobilization paradigm, which is going to often rest on alarmism, demonization. You're going to try to scare people to the polls. Whereas the persuasion paradigm says, hey, I got to meet some people where they are and sort of get them to see my perspective. And we've got way too much mobilization going on in this country and way too little persuasion.
Amen. Okay, let's move on to the other thing I really want to talk about. It seemed like just as the country was getting over Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, we needed another TV spectacle, another courtroom kind of drama to draw our attention, and we were blessed with the January 6th hearings going on the television. You wrote a piece recently about reactions, given new things that have come forward in the January 6th hearings, reactions to Mike Pence and his role in resisting the calls of Donald Trump and many others around him to facilitate this crazy plan to throw out the electors and decertify the state electors that were coming in on January 6th. You summarize, or you quoted Jamel Bouie's piece in the New York Times as representative of the left in its demonization of Mike Pence. And Jamel Bouie wrote this: yes, the vice president ultimately refused to take part in Donald Trump's power grab, but this isn't heroic. He did not go above and beyond his constitutional obligations. He simply chose not to break the law. He did close to the absolute minimum of what we should expect from a person in his position. So we shouldn't celebrate Mike Pence. He just did what every vice president before him has done and certified the election results. You argue that the left is being too hard on Mike Pence and that he deserves some credit for standing up to what was happening on January 6th. Summarize your view of Mike Pence from that day.
Yeah. So my point of view is pretty simple. Yeah, he did his duty, but in doing his duty, he was doing something. He was confronting headwinds that virtually no vice president before him had confronted. He was confronting people who are calling for trying to kill him. In that moment, they were literally trying to kill him. The January 6th Commission has put forth evidence that they got within 40 feet of him. This mob got within 40 feet. They've introduced evidence that Proud Boys and Oath Keepers actually wanted to kill Pence and Pelosi. They wanted them dead. So they're trying to kill him. The president of the United States is putting an enormous amount of pressure on him to continue his to flip the results at most or send it back to the states at least, which would have triggered a massive constitutional crisis. The pressures on him were extraordinary. And he did what he had to do. Yes, he did his duty. But we as a culture recognize that sometimes you should honor people who do their duty. That's what they're doing, is that they're doing their job. But when it's hard to do it, when there are threats on your life, when there's threats on your family's life, and almost any other circumstance that I can think of, we don't say to a fireman who's supposed to go into a building, well, that's your job, dude.
Sometimes the firemen will say that in humility. Say, I was just doing my job.
True.
But you're right. We do honor that bravery, even though it is their job.
Yeah. So, Pence had in that moment this enormous amount of pressure on his shoulders. He had a mob howling for his head. There was a gallows outside the Capitol. And he did what's right. And he saved America from a constitutional crisis that I even shudder to think. Skye, can you imagine if he had done what John Eastman asked him to do in that moment, what would have happened in the United States of America? I mean, it's terrifying to contemplate. And so my point of view is if we want to have a culture that honors people who do their duty in the face of adversity, that would include a Mike Pence, just as it includes, for example, a Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, who he just did his job as Secretary of State, or the 2 election workers in Fulton County who did their job, and we don't have any problem. And it's exactly right to honor them. It's exactly right. There was this incredible testimony by the Speaker of the House in Arizona.
It was riveting. I saw that yesterday.
Just incredible. But at the same time, this is Rusty Bowers. At the same time, he just did his duty, right? And so I think there's a particular sort of sticking point that people have with Pence, and I do too, Skye. I'll just be honest with you. He was just such a sycophant for Trump for so long. Right.
So
he was enabler in chief,
I think that's exactly what has complicated this. The whole assessment of the Trump presidency and the many people around him, and including those who, like Pence, admirably did what was right on January 6th or following the election in many of these states. I'm thinking of Bill Barr, for example. His testimony was pretty dramatic in the hearings, where he said he multiple times told the president that all of these claims of voter fraud and everything were BS. And he said it explicitly. It was bonkers. It was completely wrong. And then Bill Barr himself, when interviewed on the Today Show, was asked, would you vote for Donald Trump in 2024? And I was a little bit surprised. I think other people were, by his comments. I don't know if you saw this. He made clear that he did not want Trump to be the nominee of the Republican Party in 2024, but that if he was the nominee, he would vote for him.
Yeah, which is terrible.
Right. And this is a quote. He said, because I believe that the greatest threat to the country is the progressive agenda being pushed by the Democratic Party, it's inconceivable to me that I wouldn't vote for the Republican nominee, despite the fact that he's giving testimony and knew perhaps better than most that what Trump was attempting to do was perhaps the greatest threat to the Constitution this country's ever seen. So I think that's the dilemma, is there's people like Bill Barr and Mike Pence who at critical moments, yes, they did the right thing, but they're enabling of Trump in the years prior to January 6th, or their passive silence after the election in November 2020. And even to this day, Pence has been very quiet about his time in the Trump administration. A lot of people look at that and go, you're not just a fireman who ran into a burning building. You're a fireman who for 5 years refused to run into the burning building. But then when it was really, really, really critical, you did go in at the last minute. And so we're supposed to celebrate you for doing your job when it was critical, but you neglected to do your job for the years prior to that.
I would put it like this. You're an arsonist who finally put the fire out.
Oh my gosh, that's even worse. Yeah. So thank you for putting the fire out, but why the hell did you start it in the first place?
Yeah. No, I don't for 1 minute excuse what Mike Pence did for year after year after year until that moment in 2020. I don't. Heck, I'm angry. I'm still, I respect the heck out of Liz Cheney. I'm not going to say angry, but she was a Trump voter. I was not. She was a Trump supporter. I was not. Brad Raffensperger, he supported Trump and then did almost more than anyone else to block him in Georgia. And I just think when it comes to sort of getting past this moment, here's the thing. If I want to get us past this moment, the thing that I want to do is when somebody does something right and brave, I want to say without reservation, that was right and brave.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to denigrate it and say, oh, well, you just did your job, minimum necessary, whatever. No, that was right and brave, because I want to be a part of a movement that's very open-hearted towards people who are right and brave. And then if 6 months later or 1 month later, they do something that is not courageous or that is turning back to sycophancy, say, you're turning back to sycophancy. But what I don't want to do is when somebody is courageous is to denigrate that courage. I want to be encouraging that. And I think that one of the problems we have in our super partisan moment is that we actually, when we denigrate courage, unless they sort of come along with us completely, we disincentivize it. Because what we end up doing is we create a situation where the only tribe that these folks have is the tribe that exists if they completely, the only tribe that they're going to have is one that is sort of says, or the only way they're going to feel a sense of belonging in this country and in this culture is sort of this glide back path back to MAGA. And if we say to them, well, before we're going to honor you, before we're going to respect you, then you've got to go full prodigal son. You're putting barriers up, I think.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. You want to give them an exit strategy, a face-saving, honorable exit. People have been talking this way about Putin in Ukraine, right? How do you give him an exit strategy? Otherwise, he's just going to literally scorched earth, war in Ukraine. You got to give him a way out that saves face with his own people. Similarly, I agree with you. I think we ought to definitely honor and celebrate courage when it's displayed, affirm people who do the right thing, even if it's later than you wanted them to do it. I think what I'm still getting snagged on, though, and maybe this is the prodigal son expectation that I shouldn't have, it's been hard for me when I see these Trump officials, even before 2020, leave his administration and leave because they have strong disagreements with the president or had strong disagreements with the president, or they attest to his inability to do the job. We saw this from numerous officials, Secretary of States, Secretaries of Defense, others who were in the administration and left going, it's bonkers. You got to get out. But then after they leave, we're not asking them to join team anti-Trump or suddenly become a Democrat or something, but they don't use their knowledge and what's the right word? Their platform, their knowledge, their credible experience as a witness of the Trump administration to then do everything they can to warn the country. And you're right. So like Bill Barr coming out and going, "Oh, I'd vote for him again." It's like, what? Or Lindsey Graham, right on, was it maybe even on January 6th, said, "I'm done. I'm getting off the Trump train," or whatever he said, and then he goes back right away and becomes that sycophantic position again. That's the part I have trouble with. And it feels like Mike Pence is doing that a little bit, where, yes, what he did on January 6th was immensely courageous and grateful that he didn't go along with the plan and send the country into turmoil. But now it feels like he's passively getting back into the MAGA crowd because he has a political ambition that requires their support. And that's the part I really struggle with. It's like the person who has this moment of clarity. I mean, Hebrews talks about this, right? Someone who's tasted of the grace of God cannot, and walks away, cannot be convinced to come back again. Like, what do you do with that person where it's abundantly clear that they get what's going on? They had enough insight to do the right thing when it counted, but now they're, a dog returning to its vomit, essentially, as Proverbs says. What do you do with that person?
Yeah, so that, when Barr says what he says about the progressive agenda, especially after January 6th, where It was the closest we've come to a constitutional crisis since 1861, like a true
Absolutely.
national meltdown constitutional crisis. And then to say, well, progressive politics are worse than that. What?
Right.
Now that if you bring Trump back, you're going to court and you're going to flirt with another January 6th. So, that's the kind of thinking that created the frenzy that led to Trump in the first place. And so the Barr thing, I think, is just fundamentally, I saw that and it was just disgusting. It was just disgusting to me. Pence has done something a little different. He's talked about, he's after January 6th, he's called it a dark day. If we lose faith in the Constitution, we won't just lose elections, we'll lose our country. The very idea that he could have reversed the election, he's called un-American. I mean, he's done this different thing, and he's obviously prepping to take Trump on in the primary. And I have a lot of grace for sort of this idea of what's the best way to help the GOP get past Trump? Because I'm firmly of the belief that you're just playing with fire if you just sort of write off the GOP and say it's just a MAGA dumpster fire. There's nothing we can do about it. I mean, if Trump is the nominee in 2024, he might win the darn thing. He might win, and that would be horrific for our country. And so I've got a lot of grace for the people who are trying to move the GOP past Trump and trying to figure out different ways to do this. And I don't think there's any particular roadmap. And a lot of us who are sort of on Twitter are saying, well, unless you do A, B, C, and D, then you're not really helping here. And then I've talked to a lot of these folks who are caught between this rock and the hard place. And they say, no, you don't understand. Everyone who did A, B, C, and D, like you're urging that we do, is no longer a factor in the GOP, has been shoved completely outside the tent, and nothing, and the GOP isn't any better for it. And so it's a hard. One thing I wrote before 2020, I wrote about how we heal, and I used the prodigal son analogy. And I remember after January 6th, I thought, now, at last,
right,
finally, you're going to see people coming forward and apologizing and repenting. And I can think of maybe one person who did that, like one public figure sort of in Christian world who did that, quasi-public figure. Nobody else did it.
Right.
Nobody else did it.
I think they're too far down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So I'm sitting here thinking, for the sake of our country, yeah, I would love the prodigal son. And I would love that. I think that honestly, if you're a Christian, the prodigal son obligation is your obligation. But if I'm also thinking about how do we avoid the next existential crisis, I'm a lot more thinking, how do we move past Trump than how do we get people to repent of Trump, if that makes sense.
Yeah, from a practical point of view, I understand that. But I do wonder if we're heading for a disaster in 2024.
I wonder too.
Because there are so many people like Pence, DeSantis, Ted Cruz, who knows who else, who are posturing themselves for a presidential run. And we end up repeating the error of 2016, where you had 16 candidates who were all splitting the anti-Trump vote and allowed an open lane for him to get the nomination.
Yep.
It feels to me like the best hope of rescuing the future of the Republican Party is to run one candidate who's not Trump, who can represent essentially repentance, who can represent the party saying we're done with Trump and we want to move forward. And my guess, I don't have the data, maybe you've seen some, my guess would be that candidate has the best shot of coalescing the anti-Trump vote and making sure the party can move forward. But if you've kind of got this, well, we're not really going to repent of MAGA and Trump. We want to just move on. We're going to ignore it, brush it under the rug. We're not going to expose all the horrors that happened. And even from people within the administration, we're going to keep our mouths shut. Bill Barr is not going to, John Bolton, Mattis, Kelly, whoever, they're all just going to be quiet. Then I think you run the risk of repeating 2016, which puts Trump right back into that position. Don't we need that stark contrast in the repent versus double down option?
I would you've just described the scenario that I would love. That's just not in the cards.
It's not. Is there any capacity for a party, the Republican Party in this case, to kind of go back to the smoke-filled room to say, hey, we're putting one person forward and Trump?
No.
There's no mechanism for that.
No. I mean, we're way down the rabbit hole of weak parties, strong partisanship.
Right.
And there's no mechanism in the GOP right now for that sort of smoke-filled room. And you're going to have this. Here's my hope, Skye. Here's what I do think is a realistic hope. Well, I say realistic. In other words, not impossible. So I think there will be multiple GOP candidates in 2024.
Right.
You'll have a DeSantis in all likelihood. You'll probably have a Pence. You'll have maybe Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton. You might have a Larry Hogan, sort of an anti-Trump Republican. So you're going to have a bunch of people, and that's not necessarily a problem early.
Right.
If people actually get out when they're not getting traction the way traditionally candidates have done, then you're going to have a shot at moving to one-on-one sooner rather than later.
And can't that be structured by the party in the way they do their qualifications for debates, their qualifications for getting on a ballot, that kind of, like, if you don't have whatever, certain amount of funding, a certain amount of percentage of vote in earlier primaries, you're out?
Well, so here's the thing that the Republicans did to try to create that very system, and it made Trump nominee.
It backfired.
It backfired because what the Republicans did is they said, unlike the Democrats who have proportional allocation of delegates, so if you win 40% of the primary vote in a Democratic primary, you're getting 40% of the delegates, and the person who gets 30% gets 30%, which is one of the reasons why the 2008 Democratic primary was a slugfest for months.
Right.
Because Hillary, when she would lose a primary, would only lose the delegate race by a little bit.
Yeah.
And so they had to fight this thing out state by state for months. The Republicans looked at that and said, well, that's ridiculous. That's sort of fratricidal. So we're going to have most of our states, or many of our states, are winner take all. So,
but they define a winner as somebody who might only get 25% of the vote.
Yes. So Trump, that was key for him. So by the time he clinched the nomination in 2016, he had received a smaller minority of the vote than any Republican nominee in the history of the primary era.
Right.
But because he had a multi-candidate field and people were not dropping out because they just couldn't grasp in their minds that Donald freaking Trump could be the nominee.
I can't lose to this guy.
I'm not going to lose to, and I'm not going to be the sucker who gets out before he implodes.
Right.
So you had all these people just, I'm still mad at John Kasich. What on earth were you doing staying in there? Rubio stayed in way too long. I mean, person after person stayed in too long. And Trump, using the system the GOP created to get to a nominee faster and to try to sweep out the field earlier, got the nomination. And so it's funny that in 2016, the parties had both implemented measures that were designed to avoid things like the 2008 Democratic slugfest. And both of them worked and ended up with exactly the worst nominee for the party.
Yeah, so, I totally agree. Do you think there would be any benefit to the Republican Party adopting the Democratic Party structure of superdelegates? And would a superdelegate dynamic have prevented a Trump nomination?
That is a great question. And the reason why I brought up both of the parties had the system that they wanted and ended up with bad candidates is that it was the superdelegate system that put Hillary forward, like gave Hillary this enormous lead and she was in all likelihood the only candidate who could truly lose to Donald Trump.
So you think Bernie Sanders had a better shot of winning?
I think Bernie had a better shot and the polls all said so. The polls said, as crazy as that is, but that just tells you how toxic Hillary was in 2016.
Yeah, I agree with you. I actually totally agree with you that I never believed that Donald Trump won as much as Hillary Clinton lost.
Yeah.
But in the world of Democratic politics, Hillary Clinton was the establishment candidate.
Yeah.
And the superdelegates ensured that the establishment candidate got the nomination. In the Republican Party, Donald Trump was not the establishment candidate. So in that regard, would superdelegates have made sure that a more establishment candidate had been nominated by the party?
In hindsight, I think for sure.
I think it was just the fact that the Democratic establishment was out of touch with America. It wasn't, that was the real issue.
And I think the superdelegates helped clear the field for Hillary. So if you were a non-Bernie, even if I think it's very contentious to say that Bernie would have had a better shot than Hillary. I think he would have, but I don't know for sure. But I do think that if there were no superdelegates, then, if you're an establishment mainstream Democrat, it's a lot less daunting to take on Hillary than it was when you knew you had, say, 1,000 superdelegates already lined up against you. I mean, you were going up against a wall of opposition from the establishment. Now, the thing is now, Trump's taken over the GOP establishment.
Right. That's now it would be the superdelegates that guarantee he gets the nomination. Talking about 2024, what's the likelihood you think of President Biden not running for re-election? Is that getting more likely or less likely as time goes on?
I would say this. The more likely Trump is the nominee, the more likely it is Biden runs again.
Okay.
Because of a very simple reason. Biden beat Trump. And so if you're a Democrat, if you're going to rerun 2020, it is extremely risky from your point of view to depart from the man who actually beat Trump.
Sure, but he beat Trump without 9% inflation around his neck.
Yeah, but this decision's going to be made in 18 months.
Right.
This and Biden, there's no way Biden would announce now. The instant Biden says I'm not running, his presidency's essentially over. He's immediately a lame duck.
Right.
So there, we're about a year away from hard decisions being made here. So my question is, I think that the more it looks like the GOP will move on from Trump, I also think the more likely the Democrats will want to move on from Biden. That's just that and $2 will get you a cup of coffee. That's just rank punditry, as my colleague Jonah Goldberg says. But
okay, last question. Going back to the January 6th hearings, one of the things that struck me is the vast majority of witnesses who are testifying in these hearings are Republicans.
Yeah.
And a great number of them are strong Trump supporting Republicans, or maybe even worked within his administration or campaign.
Mm-hmm.
What's the likelihood that these hearings will have any effect on Trump supporting Republicans to move on from the president and just wash their hands of this thing? Or are they confined in such a media echo chamber that none of this is actually getting through?
Your hardcore folks are in the echo chamber. I mean, this stuff is not getting through to the hardcore, but you don't have to penetrate the hardcore to undermine Trump significantly. There was just a poll put out, University of New Hampshire poll put out that now has DeSantis leading Trump in New Hampshire. And so Trump's support in New Hampshire has gone down to basically where it was in the primaries in 2016. He won New Hampshire with about 35% of the vote in the 2016 primary. Again, going back to this multi-candidate thing, that was a big win for him with 35%. Well, he's sitting at 37%, and DeSantis is at 39% in the New Hampshire poll. So the more with each week, month that goes on, where the January 6th Commission is hitting hard with, just outrageous evidence of Trump misconduct.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump has lost in Georgia. He totally botched his endorsement in Alabama. He came in late and endorsed Katie Britt, but after it was completely clear she was going to win anyway. there's a lot of evidence that he's slipping. And so where I think that the January 6th Commission actually can make a difference is not with hardcore MAGA. It's with the more establishment, lifelong Republicans who they want to win in 2024. And everything that reminds them of that chaos is going to incentivize them to move on, not to do the prodigal son repentance, but to just move on in the way Nixon voters moved on to Reagan.
Does Trump have a weird bit of leverage on his opponents in the primary? Because, for example, Ron DeSantis, clearly he's going to run. At some point, he's going to be asked and has to clearly state what his view of the 2020 election was. Do you believe that the election was stolen in 2020? If he says no, I believe that Biden legitimately won, which is why you should vote for me because Trump lost and he shouldn't be reelected. Well, then you've inflamed the millions of supporters in the Republican Party who genuinely believe the election was stolen, and he's seen as a rhino who's not really for the... If you say, yes, I believe the election was stolen, but you shouldn't reelect Donald Trump, and I'm not willing to put my effort, then you look like a traitor as well. So you're in a catch-22.
So here's where I think this is headed, Skye. Now, again, this is worth what it's worth, but this is where I think it's headed. Smart Republicans are looking at what happened in Georgia and learning some lessons. Because what happened in Georgia was the fight in Georgia was mano a mano, Perdue versus Kemp, Raffensperger versus, Jody Heiss. It was one-on-one centered around the election steal. Okay. The quote unquote election steal.
Mm-hmm.
And the Trump candidates got blasted. And it wasn't just that Brian Kemp beat David Perdue. Raffensperger in MAGA-land was public enemy number one. He was the guy who taped Trump. He was the guy who took on Trump directly, specifically. He was Trump's number one target. And not only did he beat his MAGA competitor, he didn't even have to go to a runoff. He beat the competitor by 20.
It was brutal.
And so I think what's going to happen, and maybe it'll be DeSantis, I don't know. I think if DeSantis is shrewd, he'll do this, is that he will understand that if it's him and Trump is fighting over 2020, DeSantis wins. That Republican voters outside of the 30% of the MAGA base, that Republican voters don't want to fight over 2020. They want to go on to 2024. And at some point, if DeSantis, I think, is smart, when the time is right, if and when he announces, he's going to say, Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, I'll beat Joe Biden, which then sends Trump into hysteria over the idea that he lost to Joe Biden, which is exactly the ground where a smart Republican is going to want to fight. And he's going to say, look, Trump is focused completely on 2020. I'm focused on governing this country, the move on argument. So that's Brian Kemp, and he won by 40 points. That's Raffensperger, and he won by 20 points. So I think that
I hope you're right, but I fear you're not.
I hope I'm right too.
I fear you're not. I mean, when you see the Texas Republican Party putting that the 2020 election was stolen into their, if I'm Ron DeSantis or any of these other potential candidates, the last thing I want to do on the campaign trail is become an apologist for Joe Biden winning the election. I don't want to have to say, yeah, Trump lost, vote for me. And then people going, well, what about all, and getting all the conspiracy there. And then suddenly you're defending the Democratic position on the election in 2020.
So here's the key. So I think DeSantis is playing dangerous games. Like I haven't seen, and listeners can tell me if I'm completely wrong. I have not seen where DeSantis has come out and clearly said that Trump lost. Fair and square.
I don't think I have either, but I'm closely watching this.
Maybe he has, but if you're sitting there and you're thinking Trump might not run, then there's a calculation that says I'm not going to alienate Trump's base.
Right.
If Trump runs, you have no shot at the Trump base, that 35% hardcore. So you have to go for everybody else. And so what that does is if Trump runs, you're going to have to win without his base. If Trump doesn't run, the first thing people are going to do is, how can I grab his base? Well, one way you grab his base, one way not to grab his base is to say Trump lost in 2020.
Right.
So, but if Trump runs, his 35% is off the table. That's for Trump. And then you're going to, hey, I need 45% total or whatever to get a plurality here. And that's going to include never Trumpers. It's going to include move oners. It's going to include people who like Trump, but don't think we need to do that again because he lost. And so there's going to be a big potpourri of people that you're going to try to assemble. And in that circumstance, you want Trump talking about 2020, and you want to be the one talking about inflation.
Yeah, I think the only way the Republicans win in 2024 is if the election is about Joe Biden. But Trump has never been good at making anything about anyone other than himself.
Yeah, right.
So, and if the election becomes about 2020 and Donald Trump again, that's not good for the Republicans. David, thank you. Though your opinions are apparently only worth $2 and a cup of coffee, I don't drink coffee, but I'll take the $2.
All right.
I appreciate your input and giving us some perspective on the Supreme Court and what's going on with these hearings and life after Trump. We will be in touch as these other decisions come down. Hopefully next month when we talk again, we'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about with Coach Kennedy and Roe v. Wade and probably other cases as well that I'm forgetting about. But thank you again.
Well, thanks, Skye. It's always a pleasure. Really, I love talking to you on French Fridays.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.